Long before oil or gold shaped empires, one tiny seed changed the fate of the world. From tropical islands to the birth of New York, this is the untold story of nutmeg, a spice so precious that nations went to war for it. In the far-flung waters of the Banda Sea, nestled within Indonesia's fabled Spice Islands, grows a tree that once ruled the world. Myristica fragrans, the nutmeg tree. This evergreen beauty, with its dense green canopy and fragrant yellow blossoms, produces a fruit unlike any other. When ripe, the golden husk splits open, revealing a smooth brown seed wrapped in a crimson web, the aril. From this single fruit come two royal spices, nutmeg from the seed and mace from the red covering. For centuries, these islands were the only place on earth where nutmeg grew. The Bondanese people tended their trees with care, unaware that this humble spice would soon ignite wars and redraw world maps. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, Arab merchants were already sailing here. They kept the island's location secret, spinning tales of monsters and forbidden seas to protect their trade routes. They sold nutmeg to Venetian traders at enormous profits. A handful of spice in Asia became worth a fortune in Europe. In the medieval kitchens of Europe, nutmeg was more than a seasoning. It was medicine, perfume, and magic. People believed it could cure the plague and protect against evil. Nobles sprinkled it in wine and carried it in pouches as charms of power. Nutmeg became the symbol of luxury, and its price soared higher than gold. But behind the aroma of wealth lay a storm brewing across oceans. In 1512, a new power arrived, the Portuguese, hungry for control over the spice trade. The peaceful Banda Islands were about to meet the first wave of foreign conquest, and the world would never be the same again.
When the Portuguese fleet first reached the Banda Islands in 1512, the world of the Bondanese people changed forever. These new visitors came not as traders, but as conquerors. Led by Afonso de Albuquerque, the Portuguese sought to dominate the global spice routes, and nutmeg was their ultimate prize. They built fortresses on nearby islands, armed with cannons and soldiers. They demanded that the Bondanese sell their nutmeg only to Portugal at whatever price the Europeans decided. Those who refused were punished brutally. For the first time, the free merchants of Banda realized that their fragrant spice had become the center of an empire built on fear. From these distant islands, Portuguese ships carried nutmeg across oceans, through Goa, Malacca, and Lisbon, finally reaching the glittering markets of Venice and London. There, nutmeg was worth its weight in gold. A few sacks of it could buy a mansion, a ship, or even the loyalty of kings. But controlling a monopoly across oceans was no easy task. The Portuguese Empire was vast, their enemies many, and their greed endless. They soon found themselves stretched too thin. To maintain profits, they began subcontracting spice distribution to a rising group of merchants from a small European nation, the Dutch. The Dutch proved to be efficient, clever, and patient. As their ships sailed under Portuguese contracts, they quietly built their own network of trade across Europe. By the late 1500s, they had one of the largest merchant fleets in the world. Then came a turning point, 1580. Portugal fell under Spanish rule, and the Dutch suddenly found themselves locked out of the spice trade. Prices of nutmeg, pepper, and cloves skyrocketed across Europe, and the Dutch realized they could no longer rely on others. If they wanted spices, they would have to fight for them. And so began a new chapter in history, the rise of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, the most powerful trading empire the world had ever seen.
By the dawn of the 17th century, the Netherlands had transformed from a small seafaring nation into a powerhouse of ambition.
In 1602, a group of powerful Dutch merchants and investors came together to create something entirely new, a corporation unlike any the world had ever seen. It was called the VOC, or Verenigd Oostenlys Company, the Dutch East India Company. The VOC was no ordinary company. It had the power to make treaties, wage wars, and rule colonies. With 50,000 employees, 200 ships, and its own private army of 30,000 soldiers, it became a state within a state, an empire run by businessmen. Its goal was simple yet ruthless: control the spice trade and eliminate all competition. At that time, the world was in chaos. Across Europe, the Black Plague was spreading, killing thousands every day. Desperate for cures, doctors claimed nutmeg could protect against the disease. Suddenly, this single spice became worth a fortune. Nutmeg bought for a few pennies in Banda could sell for up to 68,000 times its price on the streets of London. Everyone wanted nutmeg: kings, merchants, commoners, and the Dutch saw their opportunity. They sent fleets of armed ships to the East Indies, determined to seize the Banda Islands, the only place where nutmeg grew. The local sultans, who had long maintained peace by trading freely with whoever came, now faced a new kind of visitor: not traders, but conquerors. The VOC didn't come to bargain, it came to rule. They began capturing smaller islands one by one, forcing local chiefs to sign exclusive contracts. But the proud Bandanese refused to bow. They believed in freedom and fair trade, and their defiance would soon lead to tragedy. A storm was coming, one that would turn paradise into a battlefield.
In 1621, the tranquil Banda Islands, once a paradise of spice and song, were engulfed in terror. The Dutch East India Company, led by the ruthless Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Koen, arrived with a mission: to claim total control over the nutmeg trade. The Bandanese people, proud and independent, refused to give up their freedom. They had traded fairly with the Portuguese and the English for decades, but to the VOC, neutrality was rebellion. Koen believed fear was stronger than diplomacy. He gathered an army of soldiers and mercenaries, surrounding the islands with warships. Then came his ultimatum: sign the treaty and sell nutmeg only to the company, or face annihilation. When the Bandanese leaders refused, Koen unleashed his army. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in colonial history. Villages were burned, trees were cut down, men, women, and children were hunted across the forests they had called home for generations. Within weeks, thousands were killed or enslaved. Only a few hundred Bandanese survived, escaping to nearby islands. The Dutch then seized total control of Banda. To protect their new investment, they destroyed all nutmeg trees outside their plantations, ensuring that no one else could ever grow it. They imported enslaved laborers from other islands to work the spice fields. Even the seeds were coated with lime so that none could germinate elsewhere, a cruel method to preserve their monopoly. For the Dutch, this was victory. For the Bandanese, it was extinction. The sweet scent of nutmeg that once carried songs of trade and prosperity now carried only the memory of blood. But the story didn't end here. Across the sea, another empire, the British, was watching, waiting for its chance to strike back.
After the Banda Massacre of 1621, the Dutch East India Company believed it had finally achieved its dream: total control over the nutmeg trade. But one small island stood in their way: a mere 3 kilometers long and less than 1 kilometer wide, the island of Run. This little island, barely visible on most maps, was under British control. The British had arrived earlier, forming friendly ties with the local Bandanese and establishing trade. For them, Run was more than land. It was a strategic foothold in the richest spice region on Earth. For the Dutch, it was an unbearable threat to their monopoly. And so began a silent yet brutal struggle between two of the world's greatest maritime powers, the Dutch and the British. For decades, they fought on sea and land, capturing each other's ships, raiding outposts, and spilling blood for control over a few specks of soil covered in nutmeg trees. Both empires saw nutmeg as power itself. Whoever owned it controlled wealth, medicine, and prestige. While battles raged in the Banda Sea, diplomats in Europe argued over treaties, while merchants grew richer from the rising prices of the spice. The British refused to surrender Run, calling it a jewel worth every drop of blood. The Dutch, equally determined, fortified every nearby island and blockaded the tiny strip of land. Years turned into decades, but by the mid-1600s, both nations were exhausted. Endless wars over distant colonies had drained their treasuries and their patience. A peace agreement became inevitable. In 1667, after nearly half a century of conflict, the two empires sat down to negotiate a deal that would change world history, the Treaty of Breda. It would be a trade unlike any other. One island of nutmeg for another across the ocean. By 1667, both the Dutch and the British were tired of war. Decades of fighting over tiny islands in the Banda Sea had drained their ships, soldiers, and silver. Each side held territories the other wanted, and neither could claim victory. It was time for compromise. The peace talks began in the Dutch city of Breda, and what emerged was one of the strangest deals in world history. The Dutch desperately wanted total control of the Banda Islands, especially Run, the last remaining nutmeg island under British influence. The British, meanwhile, had their eyes on a distant piece of land across the Atlantic, a small settlement on the island of Manhattan, then called New Amsterdam, controlled by the Dutch. After long negotiations, the two powers reached an extraordinary agreement. The Dutch would get Run Island, securing their nutmeg monopoly. The British would get Manhattan, a swampy, relatively unknown colony in North America. To the Dutch, it seemed like a perfect bargain. Why trade a spice island worth fortunes for a cold, undeveloped patch of land? But history would prove otherwise. The British quickly took control of Manhattan and renamed it New York, in honor of the Duke of York. What seemed like a minor trade would one day become the foundation of the world's most influential city, built, ironically, on the value of a spice halfway across the globe. Meanwhile, the Dutch celebrated their victory in the Banda Islands. With full control, they could now enforce their monopoly completely. They guarded every seed, burned unauthorized trees, and even coated exported nutmeg with lime so it couldn't sprout elsewhere. The world's most fragrant monopoly had been sealed, but for how long?
For more than a century after the Treaty of Breda, the Dutch ruled the Banda Islands like iron-fisted kings. Their monopoly on nutmeg was absolute. Every tree was counted, every seed was guarded, and every ship leaving Banda was searched. No one could carry a single fertile seed without VOC permission. Those caught trying faced death. The Dutch believed their system was unbreakable, but they had not counted on one man, Pierre Poivre, a daring French botanist and adventurer.
In the mid-1700s, Pierre Poivre dreamed of breaking Europe's spice monopolies. He believed spices should belong to all humankind, not be hoarded by greedy empires. So he set sail for the East Indies on a secret mission to steal the world's most valuable plants. Disguised as a trader, Poivre traveled through the Moluccas, carefully studying the Dutch fortifications and plantations. Every port, every ship, every crate was watched by guards. But Poivre was patient. After months of planning, he and his companions finally succeeded, smuggling out several nutmeg and clove seedlings hidden in wet soil and wax. He transported them to Mauritius, a small French-controlled island off the east coast of Africa. There, in secret gardens, he nurtured the stolen seedlings until they thrived. From Mauritius, these plants spread further to Réunion, India, and eventually the Caribbean. On the island of Grenada, nutmeg found a new home. The climate was perfect, the soil rich, and soon Grenada became one of the world's leading nutmeg producers, a title it still holds today. Pierre Poivre had done what no army could. He broke the Dutch monopoly, not with war, but with seeds. Yet, nature itself had one more twist to add, a catastrophe that would finish what Poivre had started.
As the 18th century neared its end, the once mighty Dutch monopoly over nutmeg began to crumble, not by war this time, but by the unstoppable forces of nature and time. In 1778, the Banda Islands faced a disaster of biblical scale. A volcanic eruption tore through the region, followed by a massive tsunami that wiped out entire villages and half the nutmeg groves. The VOC's carefully guarded plantations were destroyed in hours. The spice that had fueled empires was now buried beneath ash and seawater. The Dutch tried to rebuild, but the world had already changed. Thanks to Pierre Poivre's stolen seedlings, nutmeg was thriving far beyond Banda, in Mauritius, Réunion, India, and especially in the Caribbean island of Grenada. No empire could now claim ownership over the spice. The monopoly that had cost so many lives and turned paradise into a battlefield was finally over. Then came another turning point. In 1809, during the Napoleonic Wars, British forces invaded the Banda Islands and took control. Before returning them to the Dutch in 1717, the British did something brilliant. They transplanted hundreds of nutmeg trees to their own colonies across southern Asia. From Sri Lanka to Penang, from Malabar to the Caribbean, nutmeg found new homes and new hearts to flavor. By the mid-19th century, the spice that once grew in only one small cluster of islands now belonged to the entire world. The story had come full circle, from monopoly to freedom, from blood to bounty. Today, nutmeg is grown in Indonesia, Grenada, India, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka. It flavors food, perfumes air, and reminds us of how a single seed once changed the destiny of nations. From the Banda Islands to New York City, its legacy endures, a fragrant whisper from history. And that's how a tiny spice shaped empires, sparked wars, and even helped create New York. The story of nutmeg isn't just about trade. It's about greed, courage, and the power of nature to reclaim balance. If you loved uncovering this untold chapter of history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Rootify Mist, where every story reveals the roots of our mysterious world.